Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Talking Landscape Photography. We have a very special guest from America that I've been admiring from afar, I should say, for a very, very, very long time. I've been very influenced by her incredible black and white work, by her prolific and very intimate relationship with the natural world, both as a naturalist and also as someone that's really gravitated to the intimacy of scenes and particularly the plant world. She's a very big figure in the US community. She's an educator and a writer and a workshop operator. And I've personally benefited from a lot of her ebooks over the years in certain places in Death Valley and Iceland and black and white work. And we'll touch base on that. She's very involved as a naturalist in various kind of communities and also in the NPN in America, which is a big one. So welcome, Sarah Marino, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to this a lot.
Thanks so much for joining us. Yes, awesome.
So, Sarah, just for the benefit of our audience, I'm sure a lot of people in your neck of the woods are very familiar with yourself and your work, and over here, down under, as we call it, maybe a little bit less so. So, as much as I'm sure you've spoken about it many times before, it'd be lovely to just get a bit of a sense of a background and maybe in general, right up to how photography serves a role in your life, and just to give people a bit of a bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say my photography is my life. I think that's a pretty obvious answer to that question, just based on how I spend my time. In terms of how I got to this point, back in, I would say probably 2008, 2009, I was working an incredibly stressful job in the nonprofit sector, and I was the co-director of a nonprofit organization. I was in graduate school full-time working on my master's of public administration, which is essentially like how to manage public and nonprofit organizations. And I was just maxed out. Pretty much the only thing that gave me a little bit of a rest was going out into nature. So I would go hiking, took a little point and shoot. I found the memory card for it a few weeks ago, and it was a 16 megabyte memory card, which is pretty fantastic. It wouldn't even fit a single file from my Canon R now, or Canon R5. So back to being in grad school, working a really crazy job, going out into nature. I'm like, oh, this photography thing is kind of fun. And then I realized it was literally the only time I ever slowed down. My mind was so incredibly busy, constantly going. And it's like, wow, I actually feel relaxed doing this. So I just continued to do it more and more, made some changes in my life that made it possible to go from working in an organization to running my own consulting business. So working with nonprofits and foundations across the state of Colorado. I did that for a few more years, and then I moved to a very small rural community where that really didn't work out anymore. So that was the point at which it kind of was like, do I continue doing my consulting work or do I try photography full time? And I tried photography full time. And that was about 2016 where I started making the transition. And then I think 2019 is where I made the full decision to go all into nature photography. So it was pretty much the transition because I was just completely stressed out in my life that I started doing photography, and here I am.
Yeah, it's a big transition. Luke can probably relate to that in terms of his own story to some extent.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy decision to make, especially if you have a well-paying job or what have you, and you've got all of that security, and it's a bit like jumping into the deep end, isn't it? And just sink or swim kind of scenario.
Yeah, my timing was absolutely awful because it was right around the pandemic. So it's like my first set of workshops were all canceled, which was really disappointing. But I also think it turned out to actually be helpful because I was able to clarify what I really enjoy doing, which is teaching more in the online space. I really enjoy making videos. I like writing ebooks. I'm going to start working on 2 printed books. So I think that I was able to say, actually, I like teaching in person here and there, but I don't want to be one of those people that has like a 12 or 15 workshop schedule. So the timing was horrible. I recovered. It was fine. Like in retrospect, it was okay. So that's been it wasn't the smoothest transition. I can say that.
It's
I
sort of,
don't
I
know if there's a
noticed
rule
that.
book for how it works anyway. I think it's all, everyone's got their own unique journey when it comes to that. So it sounds like you've found a really good path there, and yeah, no, that's a really good realization to focus on an area that suits you and your style a lot better. So that's great.
I will acknowledge something consistent, I think, for all of us, that there's fewer and fewer full-time photographers in the world, and in some ways, I'd like to quietly acknowledge the courageousness, of yourself and Luke and a little bit myself. Like it takes some guts to back yourself and to find a way to navigate a realm, particularly if you come from somewhere with really consistent work and income. You need to be very quick on your feet and willing to adapt and evolve. It's a very, very fast evolving profession and genre all the time, and we'll touch on that a little bit in the episode. So a little dosh to the cap for all of us. So I don't know how you feel, Sarah. Like now looking back and that going full time, are you still happy? Is it still where you want to be? Is it full steam ahead?
Yeah, well, I was waffling quite a bit when I first did it because I loved my former work and I felt like I was really good at it. I had consistent clients and it was just, so for like the first year, I was, because of the pandemic in part, I kept on looking back thinking like this was not a good choice. And now I saw some friends from the nonprofit world over this last weekend, and listening to their lives and now thinking about what my career looks like, it was actually a good reminder that I'm really happy doing this. I don't have as good of or as strong of a network and as supportive of a community as I had in my prior profession. That was one of the best things about working in the nonprofit world, is it was just a really wonderful community of people, very collaborative. And this is much more isolated, but I feel like this is pretty much a perfect way to build on my skills. So I did a business degree and a history degree in college. So got writing skills from the history degree, business knowledge from the business degree, and then I did my master's and learned a lot about managing resource constrained organizations. And then all my consulting work was around management and leadership and coaching executives. So all of those skills then translate really nicely to a photography business where it's also a resource constrained environment. You have to do a lot of stuff on your own. You have to know how to do a newsletter and do your own ebook design and figure out your website, do your finances, like all that stuff. You can outsource a lot of that stuff. I don't. But it's like all those things are skills I learned when I was either running or consulting with nonprofit organizations. So I actually think I have a lot of assets. Like I'm lucky that my previous career led really nicely into what I'm doing now. And I didn't actually have to learn all that stuff. Because I know that a lot of my peers really struggle with all of those things, that they just want to do photography. Yeah, you do, Paul?
Oh yeah, I'm not the first or last to admit it. I'm more of an artist than a businessman, and it doesn't mean I have any less passion or ability as a photographer. But it's in terms of making a living and a career out of it. It's if you don't have those aspects to your bow, it can be a real challenge. And I lean on Lukey a little bit now and again because he has more of an IT and production sort of skill base than I do. I have other skills that round out like a collaborative approach because Luke and I do quite a bit of stuff together. And we'll touch into it later. As much as you're in isolation, you also are also in a partnership of kinds, and we'll check in about that. But it's yeah, I agree with you there, and it was something that really struck me, Sarah, about the production value of what you're capable of creating. And the fact that it seems very clear that you're doing it yourself speaks of a much, much wider and broader skill set that a lot of photographers actually have. And I think if you don't have them, you maybe are smart enough and have enough relationships to kind of outsource them, but then you need to have the funds to do it as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge you again as someone who very much seems to be doing it all themselves. And I'm not quite there yet, with web work and ebooks and that kind of thing. And I'd like to be, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of love and a lot of craft to be able to do them well.
I think the other side to it is, excuse me, that's a bad timing. It's not only just it's taking a lot of time for those things, but there's so many things that you can do. It's like, what do I pick? And I sort of say sometimes the world's your oyster, but holy shit, the world's my oyster. Like, what do I do with all of this? Like, I've got a limited amount of time. and there's so many cool things I could do. How do I choose which is the one that I should do and actually stick to that without getting distracted and doing something else as well? So it's not just about having finite time on working on one thing. It's in some ways you can get paralyzed by how much opportunity there is, which is a really wonderful place to be, but it's also it can be a horrible place to be as well. Have you experienced that much, Sarah?
Oh, absolutely. I think I would agree that that's actually a really big challenge in doing this full time. Is like if I opened up my to-do list right now, I have years worth of ideas. And on one day, one of those ideas sounds the best. And then on the next day, a different idea sounds the best. And I think like keeping that focus is really hard. Or for some reason, I'll be like, oh, well, this new place seems really interesting. Should we go to the new places or should we continue going back to the old places so that we can actually get to the point of having portfolios that can turn into a book project? So it's like the push and pull between like going and experiencing new photography things and then using the assets that I already have to create projects. And it's staying focused and disciplined. Discipline is the number one characteristic I wish that I had more of. I'm reasonably disciplined, but I have some people around me who are very disciplined. And it's just like, if I could hone that skill, I think like Eric Bennett, he would be a great example of somebody in the US where he has 4 children and yet he very consistently puts out articles. He puts out tutorials. He's working on his second book. And or Matt Payne, who has a full-time job. He has a podcast where he puts out an episode every week. He's doing great photography work. If I could just get a little closer to the Matts and Erics of the world, I think I would feel a little bit better about my focus and discipline.
I think there's always someone that I'm sure that they'd probably say, oh, but this person can do that. And this person, there's always someone else that seems to do it better than you do.
It's that fine line. And it is a significant part of being a photographer. That fine line of comparison can be the thief of joy. And you can, if you have the fortitude, you can use that as motivation. And if you're on a low point, it can be a real challenge to constantly be seeing people around you doing things that you're hoping to do or want to do and haven't quite reached yet. And I think that's quite a juggle. And I think in our medium as photographers, we're utterly barraged on a daily basis by the opportunity for comparison to other people. And I'd say arguably more than many professions in the world. And
there's not many professions where you can just, for example, you can't go, oh, now I'm a professional dentist, like you can't just pick up a drill and say you're a dentist, but you can do that with a camera. And so I think there's definitely an aspect to that as well that makes, you see a lot of up and coming photographers that are just creating such amazing work, and it's hard to sometimes rationalize that in your mind about your own journey and that kind of thing, and it can get quite dangerous if you don't let your thoughts like work for you, I suppose, if you look at it that way.
Yeah, I think the comparison piece, like that's a really good point. That yes, I did just compare myself to Eric and Matt, and I think on the business side, I feel like I try to never compare my photography work to other people because everybody's situation is different. We all see the world differently. I'm drawn to quieter scenes. And I think as part of figuring out who I was as a photographer, I came to a level of comfort with the fact that I know my work is never going to get as much attention as some other people, because like photographing a little patch of moss on a log, like that's not going to be like the showstopper when somebody's scrolling through Instagram. But it makes me feel good and I'm proud of my work. So I try to never compare myself on the photography side, because I do think that that's demotivating, can be demotivating, and can stir up some other things that aren't necessarily positive in terms of creativity. But on the business side, I do generally think that doing a little bit of comparison, or maybe benchmarking, might be a better way to look at it. That to me, that is motivating to think like if I pushed myself a little bit harder, or if I tried to take a few more risks, that actually I need to do that. So I think that I look at the comparison piece a little bit differently when we're talking about the business side versus the photography and creative side.
I guess it can also help you to find different areas that aren't actually being actively worked on as well. So you can find like a little niche there that you can work with. And if you're not keeping a finger on the pulse or seeing what else is going on out there, it's really hard to understand where you fit within the broader sector, I suppose.
Yeah, I think Lukey's point earlier, I think in that regard was pretty fantastic. Like I mean, you need to do that in any sort of business. You need to know how the market's working and where you position yourself, and it's clear you do a really good job of that, Sarah. If you don't mind going back to a question before, which I really love that Lukey brought up in terms of that getting lost in the potential avenues of how to relate your work to the wider world. There's so many different platforms and mediums. It's not even funny. And you seem to have chosen a certain few. Do you want to speak to yourself about where you see the relevant platforms are now, why you've chosen the ones that you have, and maybe later in the conversation where you see things heading in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was running a nonprofit organization and doing strategic planning and leadership development work with nonprofit professionals, one of the main exercises that I went through with those people was like create a list of the 25 things that you want to accomplish in the next 5 years, order them, and then the top 3 are the things you focus on, and the rest are things you do not do under any circumstances until you're done with the top 3. So that's something that I've been doing a lot with my own business, is that I have a huge list of ideas that I want to pursue, but I've been really focused on really wanting to do a book, one educational book and one portfolio book. So those are my 2 goals right now. Also getting through my backlog of photos. So working on processing many years of work that has never seen the light of day. And then also just being more consistent in putting myself out into the world. So those are my 3 buckets. So I would consider educational materials, portfolio, and getting through my backlog, and then just being more consistent about sharing my work. And I think that last piece around the platform, so I'm not good about sharing work on Instagram, but I would say that's probably that and YouTube are where I get the most traction. So those are the 2 places that I'm focused right now. I think that the struggle that I'm having is something that we discussed before starting the recording, which is around production value. So I feel like my ebooks have a pretty high production value for being a person that doesn't have any background, like any formal education in graphic design. But then when you start adding videos into the mix, that's a totally different can of worms. So I'm learning a lot, but I still am having trouble investing the amount of time. Like, I feel like I'm getting to the point where I can put together a good video, but then it's also is this a good return on investment? So I don't really have a good answer for this particular question based on my own experience. I get the most traction on Instagram and YouTube. I like writing the most. So like, what do I do with that ball of wax? I don't know. I actually am really working through this right now on my own, because it's like, I know what's working and I know what I like, and those 2 things don't necessarily align. So from a business perspective, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. Check back with me in a couple of years.
There's a pretty good alignment there with writing and YouTube, though, because I mean, generally speaking, you should have a script for a YouTube video. So I guess you could translate it through that way. I certainly would love to be more active on YouTube outside of talking landscape photography as well. So, but yeah, I can hear what you're saying, and sometimes, you know, we're, as photographers, especially still photographers, we're not really video minded, I suppose. So creating videos and learning a whole new skill set there is a lot of additional time and resource required to make that happen. And so kudos for at least you know, making that happen and getting traction there. That's really good.
I think one of the things, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, no, just in terms of your Instagram, as much as you were suggesting you weren't so good at it, the caliber of what you put out both in imagery and writing is fantastic. And I actually I was looking at it this morning going, geez, there's so much story and narrative and insight and personality and offerings that come through the writing that you put on your posts as well. And I think that's quite uncommon. And I think that adds a huge amount of value. And it isn't necessarily about volume, then it's about the caliber. And you obviously take a lot of time to really reflect on what you can offer from a writing perspective with your visual work as well. And I just wanted to point that out, as I think that's really significant, Sarah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'm also top of the hat, like the video thing. It's a very different way of thinking. It's a whole different skill set. It's a craft in itself, and you just don't learn it overnight. And it's a lot of give and take and false starts and so on. And so I was pretty impressed when you were speaking about taking on that more and more. I was like, well, that's a can of worms. All right, but it is a medium that, it's the second biggest search platform in the world. YouTube, it's a very significant medium. So do you see sort of in the future, like not just for yourself necessarily, but on a global level, do you see those two as still being the most significant ones going forward in the next sort of 5-10 years, or not really sure, or watch this space, or what do you see about other people doing that you think works on other mediums in particular?
I am not willing to make any predictions out that far. with everything coming with AI, and like it just feels like things could go in two directions where people like us, like real creators of real images of real moments in nature, could become even more valued by society. Or if people can just type a prompt into Midjourney and that really catches on, like, will it devalue photography even more? So at this point, I think there's just so much unknown with regard to some of those bigger societal trends and technological trends that I would be happy to say within 1 to 2 years, I think Instagram and YouTube are still going to probably be the biggest places to grow an audience that you don't, to attract or to connect with people that you don't already necessarily have a connection with. But for my own business, I think I'm much more like, I'm getting a lot more traction out of creating things for my existing audience and getting those people more engaged. So I maintain a newsletter list. I put a lot of time into my newsletter, working on a website, putting out free portfolio ebooks for people that are on our list. So I feel like I'm focusing just as much on cultivating my existing audience as I am on growing an audience with a YouTube or an Instagram.
So what's if you really simplify things and maybe personalize things a little bit, if you wake up in the morning, what gets you out of bed? What gets you excited? What are the aspects of your life and role as a full-time photographer that is it all equal? Does it change day to day? Do you have really obvious things on a personal level you most look forward to? You spoken, there's a lot of skill sets there in terms of writing and taking the images and the business side of things and the different platforms you use. What's at the deeper core of Sarah Marino that gets her excited?
It's nature, like the absolute joy of finding something new. I'm like, if I'm taking a hike and I see a flower or a plant or a pattern or something I've never seen before, or the light is amazing, like that's what gets me excited about nature photography. And that's what keeps on getting me out. This is one of the only things I've ever stuck with in my life. And I think it's because it just feels like it's endlessly challenging, having so little control over everything that we do, whether it's seasonal conditions, light, how I'm going to feel when I show up on a particular day. So I think just generally the fact that I find nature so fascinating and there's so much to discover that it just feels like it's new. Every time I go to even places I've visited many times before, I find new things. And I think that sense of discovery, feeding curiosity, learning more about the natural world, and then the fact that sometimes it's just endlessly frustrating and challenging. And it's like, I just want to get better. And so I think those are the things that keep me going. Like, I think it's exciting to look from my photos that I was taking in 2008 and look to where I am now and feel like that's a lot of progress and it's a lot of work and it feels like a huge accomplishment. So I think all of those things, like that's the core of the motivation. But then on the business side, it's like, I like being able to figure out what my life looks like. I like to be able to live in a small town, I don't have a full-time job with somebody telling me where to be, when to be there, what to do. It's like every day I can pretty much create for myself. And I like that control over my life. So I think those are the things that drive me. And then like the ability to just use some cheap online tools like newsletter lists, affordable websites, social media. You can really create your own destiny and opportunity. So I think that it's that all of those things coming together that
it's a pretty
keeps
cool
me
mix, isn't
excited.
it? Yeah. And I'm sorry about my voice today. I don't know what's going on. How do you, if you're going to go out into nature, how much of it is reactive in terms of, oh, the conditions are this way right now, I need to go, excuse me, versus if it's kind of like you've got a trip planned. So is it very much more on the planned side, or do you have the flexibility to be able to just, oh, it's going to be a good sunset tonight, I'll pop out?
Well, the way that my husband and I travel, and I think it's important to explain to your audience that I'm married to a nature photographer. So I do this full time. He has a job as a software engineer, but he works from home. So he has a totally remote job. And we both are equally passionate about nature photography. We have an RV, so we travel a lot in our RV, and then we live in a really scenic part of Colorado. So we're very nearby, lots of incredible scenery pretty much all the time. So I can go out for photography whenever I'm interested generally, but I tend to do it more when we're traveling than when we're at home. Generally though, in terms of the reactive versus planning, I don't have any app like Photo Pills or the Photographer's Ephemeris or any of those on my phone. So I think that alone suggests that I'm not into planning. Aside from looking at the sunrise and sunset times and the general weather so that I know how to dress, I pretty much go out not expecting really anything. If I've scouted a particular location and I have a composition in mind and I'm going back for better light, that is pretty much the only time I plan. Otherwise, I'm going out and I'm seeing about like, will I be most interested in working on intimate landscapes, or am I going to see some interesting plants and flowers and I'm going to focus on doing that? Or does the light seem particularly interesting? If so, then I'm going to look for a grand landscape composition. And I have no idea when I leave what I'm going to do. It really depends on the weather, my mood, just generally what's happening. So I would say that 95% of the time I'm totally reactive. And then the 5% when I'm planning something, it's because I'm going back to redo something that I already saw. I'm never like conceiving a photo on Google Image or on Google Earth, figuring out what time of year, what day I should be there, and then waiting. Like I haven't done that for like 8 or 9 years.
It's interesting the different approaches people have, and yeah, I'm very much on the other side of the fence there, so that's quite interesting just to see the different approaches. And I think there'd be something quite freeing about going in with no expectations or plans, and being more adaptable to the conditions and seeing what arises. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Can I turn a question around on you, Luke? Because the reason that I stopped, so I used to do like following or having a plan for grand landscape photos. And I generally was finding that I was getting really frustrated and really like I couldn't handle constantly being disappointed. So I'd go out expecting things to align, they didn't align, and then I'd be frustrated. So I'm curious, like since it sounds like we have somewhat different approaches, like is that motivating for you or demotivating?
Oh, it's actually incredibly motivating for me. In fact, I would almost say that it's what drives me, because I've got to a point now where I can actually have a pretty good certainty about the conditions that I'm looking for being there when I arrive, to the point where I've had shoots where and it doesn't sound as romantic perhaps, but I can turn up and have a shot planned, take the shot within 30 minutes and then leave, and I've got my shot. So it doesn't happen always like that, but yeah, from my perspective, being able to have those skills and being able to plan means that I can sort of dream up shots, see if that actually work, and then execute them in a way where I'm getting, I guess, return on my time investment. So yeah, so in some ways that's, you know, pretty exciting. And I actually have a whole library of potential shoots that I can roll out when the conditions are there. So mind you, I still do trips where I'll have to adapt and change if the conditions aren't there, but it's nice to have a hook, I suppose, or something like that that actually draws me out to those situations. So that's pretty, yeah, it's more just I put a lot of time into learning those skills so that I can not be disappointed, I suppose.
And I'm a little bit on your side of the fence, Sarah, and but at the same time, I've been influenced by people like Luke, and I've learned a lot in terms of the capacity and the skill and nuance of being able to read the conditions to that level of understanding what I'm very, very likely to be facing if I choose to go, and what I want to see. But I just got back from, you know, a 4,500 kilometer aerial safari last night, so it's kind of like that's one of the most reactive processes you can possibly do. And yet, before you get on the plane, there's a lot of planning involved in terms of route and route finding and season and time of year and that kind of thing. But once you're in the air and you're shooting, it's all bets are off. You have no idea what you're going to see half the time. You've got less than a second to create a composition. So I find that leans into my strengths. I like switching off the mind and just being responsive. But I noticed you made a comment on one of your Instagram posts, like where you saw I hope you don't mind me saying, it was I think it was a workshop operator in Death Valley, and they all went out to get a very specific shoot. And it was the conditions weren't there, and it failed, and they're all milling around, not, and it was kind of like, all right, there's nothing to do now. And he was sitting there going, well, wait a minute, turn around or look down, and that sense of adaptability that Luke alluded to earlier was very, very clear in your approach, and that kind of really flows through how you roll, I guess.
Yeah, that night was ridiculous. So we were standing out on the Death Valley salt flats, and sound travels. So even though we were pretty far away, like the people we could hear talking were like this tiny on the very bottom of a wide angle photo. But we could hear the instructor, who is one of the most well-known photographers in North America. And he was essentially barking instructions at his workshop group to face west, where there was going to be a sun star, and they were only supposed to be waiting for the sun star. Well, there's a massive bank of clouds over the mountains. So it's like once the sun went behind the clouds, like the sun star opportunity isn't going to happen. And he's essentially standing there telling everybody, like, we're here for the sun star. Like, that's what we're doing. That's all we're here for. Stay facing west for the sun star. And it's like, well, that opportunity is gone. And you can see this workshop of people just milling around, doing nothing. Well, I'm photographing the interesting dappled light in the opposite direction, where it's like all this beautiful layers of light on the mountains. They're really cool little salt patterns on the edges of their wet salt circles. And on the edges of those salt circles, there are all these crazy patterns. So it's like there's all this other stuff to do, both wide angle landscapes facing east, telephoto landscapes, macro photography, intimate landscapes. And it's just like, what a closed-minded way to look at the world. Like, yes, it's fine if you plan, but then to essentially be telling your workshop students that there's nothing else, and that we've essentially wasted our time being here because the bank of clouds eliminated the opportunity for a sun star. Like, I find that style of nature photography education to be really problematic, because it closes off opportunities. It's like the light is bad, the composition I planned for isn't going to work, there's nothing here to shoot. Like, that kind of negativity pervades this field, I think, in a really pernicious way. And I'm always looking for opportunity expanding perspectives, where it's like, okay, I got there, I was planning to photograph the sun star, big wide angle scene, but it's not working out. So that adaptability that we've been talking about, what else can I do? I'm here. I might as well try some other things. Might as well get out my long lens, work on macro photography. And I guess I would just rather see the world in a more expansive way and see opportunities in a more expansive way, be adaptable, and feel like I'm happy and having fun doing this instead of being disappointed. So yeah, that was an interesting experience, because
Yeah,
nobody
really
was
good.
Like you're paying for a workshop and you're doing nothing.
Yeah, it's so weird, isn't it? It's a good anecdote, and I often say when I actually do some training in this space online as well in terms of planning. One of the best ways to put it is you need to know when to hold them and when to fold them. And so
Yes.
some people don't know when to fold them, and they'll just keep trying to make something work that's not working. And really, there's better opportunities out there. And yeah, that you're definitely speaking to one of those situations.
Sarah, I also just was getting ready this morning. I watched one of your highlights on your Sarah Marino photo Instagram, and it was about the focal length that you use. And what really stood out to me is the incredible variety that you use. Because one of the questions we often ask our guests is, what's your favorite focal length? And I don't know if you've got one, because when I looked at that, it's like 16, 35, 24, 105, 100 macro, another macro, 100 to 400. And I was just like, everything had its role. And I
Must have a
think
big bag.
you just kind
No,
of
I
alluded to
don't.
the fact that you're kind of you like to be ready for anything, and I think as a responsive photographer, it helps having a few tools. Have you had times where you've literally just stuck with one focal length for a long time, or really nurtured, a particular genre, like just close up macro, and just kind of isolated yourself from other things? Or have you always been kind of one eye in the back of your head, and whatever tool you've got, you want to have ready for whatever may present?
Yeah, I would consider myself to be agnostic in terms of a favorite lens. If I had to choose one, it would be my 100 to 500, just because it's such an incredibly versatile tool. But I use every lens I have in my bag for every type of scene. So I have 14 to 35, a 24 to 105, a 100 millimeter macro, a 100 to 500, a 70 to 200, and then Ron, my husband, has an 800 millimeter that takes our 1.4 teleconverter.
Wow.
So that's essentially 14 to 1120 or 1140. Can't remember
Yeah,
what
that's why I was
the
asking.
math is. So, and I use all of those. Like I use my 14 to 35 for abstracts all the time, like where you're taking advantage of all that wide angle distortion just by pointing down at something and then having a radiating composition happen, just like the same way that those lines, like exaggerating lines with the grand landscape, you can do the same thing with an abstract scene, all the way to taking landscapes with the sky at 500 millimeters. So it's just a much more compressed, intimate view. So I generally, I think I lost track of your actual question, Paul, but generally,
favorite focal lengths.
Yeah, I would say, like, I go through phases of where, like right now I'm in a phase where I feel like I should be spending more time on grand landscapes, just because I think I've gone a little bit too in on, like, I really enjoy the patterns in macro photography and intimate landscapes, but I feel like I haven't been diverse enough recently. So this summer I'm hoping to do a lot more grand landscapes, like more traditional grand landscapes.
Yeah, go walking with Matt Payne. That'll sort you out.
He
I'm
lives on the
interested
other
too.
side of the mountains from me, so there's
Oh,
a
there you
very good
go.
chance I'll see him this summer.
Yeah, great.
When you go out into the backcountry, I suppose, do you do multi-days, or is it more car based, or and maybe you could speak a bit to the equipment that you take out there? I'm sure people will be interested to know how you get about out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big hiker, which I think sometimes surprises people because they think that like the type of intimate photography I do, well, it's just, of course, you're standing on the side of a road with a telephoto lens. But usually, like I absolutely love hiking, and we do anywhere from 2 miles to 15 miles a day whenever we're out for photography. And we do some overnight trips. I'm actually going on my first overnight rafting trip in 2 days. So seeing
Wow.
how that works,
Right.
testing the waters with camera gear and dry bags and seeing how that goes.
Well, we both have
But
quite a bit of
generally,
experience with that, so feel free to ask us.
oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. I would take any pointers that you have.
Well, the simple, are you on just a conventional whitewater raft?
Yeah, it's through one of the canyons here in Colorado.
Yeah, so accessibility is a really key component. So what I tend to do is you kind of going to make, generally I use a small case that really generally only has enough room for one lens and one body, just because it's hard to position a bigger case somewhere that is readily accessible on the boat, depending on the design of it. So maybe work with the people that are doing it and get a sense of where that is. So, and then I'd have a dry bag probably sealed up twice with other lenses. But generally when I got in the morning, I'm like, I'm looking ahead. Well, we're going into a wider place. What am I going to be focusing on? This is my lens for starters. And then when we have a break, you might be able to swap that around. But having one right there, like right next to the paddle, ready to go, you can instantly pop out and pop back in again. It makes a huge difference to what you end up getting on a trip like that. I have a friend that got a really big pellet case. And, oh my God, it's going to be amazing. It's going to have all access to everything. And the only place it could fit is right at the bottom of the back of the raft. And he couldn't get to it until he stopped at the end of the day. So it was kind of like accessibility is a really big part of it. And then it's up to you where that risk is, how much you read the water ahead in terms of how long you keep the lenses out for. Reading the water ahead is a skill that takes a little bit of time, but Lukey, what do you got to offer on that regard?
Oh, I think you've nailed it there in terms of you when you're on a raft, you feel like you're going to have a lot more ability to do things than you actually do, and so everything needs to be close, easy to open up. Obviously, when it's closed up, it needs to be waterproof. And it's not a really good idea to have the actual camera itself waterproofed or in a housing or anything, because that just makes it very challenging to handle. So yeah, it's a pretty challenging environment actually to actually find yourself in photographing. I actually did a 10-day trip flying a drone off of a raft for a film project, and it's just a very it's the challenge is part of the fun, but and also the thrill of getting your gear back without it being drowned is also pretty nice as well.
I guess there's a bit of discernment around whether you're using the raft to get to special places, in which case that conversation is a little bit less relevant, because you can access your gear when you stop more easily. If you're doing only land-based sort of work and using it to get there. I mean, Luke and I were doing sort of documentary stuff as well, as in we were needing to shoot while we were on the water or on the way as part of the journey. So that's a little bit different in terms of the approach. I'd always just have a little, like a Olympus Tough or something in my pocket. I'd often have a little bum bag on my side for extra equipment and things that was waterproofed on the side to access. But yeah, it's a bit of a dance. I did 23 days down the Grand Canyon, so I had a bit of practice on that one.
Oh,
but I did.
It's an incredible experience, though. Anytime you do something like that, it's I'm sure you'll absolutely love it. So, yeah,
the reason that we're doing this trip is just because we'd like to do the Grand Canyon, and it feels like do a little test run before signing up for a full multi-week Grand Canyon
Really
trip.
good idea, because it's once you're in the canyon, there's one pull-out spot if you want to climb 5,000 feet to get out. Like what you've got is what you've got, and that's it. So there's no flipping around. And on a wind trip to the Grand Canyon, 23 days, how do you manage your power and your batteries, and everything else? We actually hired marine batteries and actually did charging at night. We even took a laptop and downloaded because it was such a long trip. So very good idea, I think, to do a test run, because the Grand Canyon will be one of the greatest trips of your life, and to feel confident and ready and capable with what you've got, which will never be perfect, but at least will get you in a position where you're going to be reasonably comfortable in terms of what you're going to accomplish.
You'd probably be going more the wide angle too, wouldn't you, Paul? Like in general, or like a 24-105.
Yeah, I oscillate between 16 and 35 and 24-105 in the first part of the trip, and as I got further into the trip and more settled into already get a lot of established shots, I started going longer in the 7200 and being a bit more intimate. And what I did find is with a small pellet case, I'd have a strap to it that I could use to strap into the boat, and I would then use the same strap when I jumped out of the boat to put it over my shoulder and carry the pellet case with me. So again, I could use it as something on land and on water at the same time. Not super comfortable depending on the strap you got, but it meant you could quickly jump into side canyons. There's like 350 side canyons on the Grand Canyon. You could spend an entire lifetime doing side trips on there, and it's worth maybe doing a little bit of homework as to where. And I know you're very familiar with canyoning, and I noticed on your recent trip you just found 20 new canyons in Death Valley alone. So I used a dry suit because I was in winter, and why I like that is I never had to worry about temperature issues and jumping in the water with my pellet case. And some of those canyons, you get to a certain point, and all of a sudden water fills up the entire breadth of it, and you can't physically get through without going through the water. And so with the dry suit, I had no hesitation to just jumping straight in, and the pedal case would just float along the water and I'd just keep going. So it really accentuated the accessibility of getting down places that other people were a bit stuck, or I could do that, but then I'd be hypothermic for the next 2 hours. Like this kind of managing temperature is quite a big part of a trip like that. And that obviously is very dependent on what time of year you're going.
It's interesting though, because you think that if you're going in summer or a warm part of the year, often the water's still very, very cold because because it's in a canyon, the water's not actually seeing a lot of light during the day, and so it's often colder than you might think in there. So that's always a consideration, keeping warm.
And then dynamic range is a big feature. You know, there's so much contrast in the canyons, but at the same time, those canyon walls are the biggest softbox. The amount of reflected light bouncing around in those places is incredible. And, you know, with someone with your eye, you will not need to go far to get some beautiful, intimate and scene work. I know there's lots of jokes in America about mud cracks. We don't really have them over here, Sarah. It's a bit like, what's that? If we got mud, it's a pile of squishy mud, and normally you're knee deep in it trying to get rid of it, not spend time with it. So
yeah, it's either sand or it's not much in between, is there?
Mud's not really a photographic component to our photography in general.
Did you see much up on the plane, Paul, on the last trip you were on?
Oh, you know, you could argue that something. Mate, I won't even get started, man. It's one of the best trips of my life.
You'll have to do another show about that one. I think
I'm quite gobsmacked of what I just saw in the space of time. It's like, oh my god.
And so, in terms of getting around, Sarah, do you also then like you'll stay out in a tent and remote campsites and take everything you need to survive on your back and that kind of aspect?
Yeah, we do some backpacking. I used to do more. We bought an Airstream trailer, which is like in the US, they're more iconic. They might not be familiar to your audience, but they're essentially like silvery RVs that are kind of modern. Instead of like most RVs are disgustingly ancient inside, ours is like a little sleek studio apartment on wheels. So we bought that in 2014, and that has totally changed my tolerance for travel. Like I hate hotels now. I don't like tents as much as I used to. So we don't do quite as much backpacking as we used to, but I still definitely enjoy it. And then back to the gear conversation, then it's like figuring out what am I supposed to take, and then just analyzing the scenery that I think I'm going to expect, and then just making some compromises. So usually for a backpacking trip, I'm probably going to take a 24-105 and a 70-200. Those would probably be the two that I would choose. Or if it's like a wildflower trip, which is one of the things I'm hoping to do this summer, probably more the 14-35 and a macro lens, because I'm assuming I'd want to do grand landscapes and then focusing on flower portraits and that kind of thing. And then the 100-500 would be too heavy to be taking on a multi-day trip.
Sarah, do you have the new RF 7200? It's a lot lighter than the traditional tank.
Yeah, it's like the size of this mug. It's so tiny.
Oh, I want one, grasshopper.
Yeah.
Which is the, because I'm a counter shooter too, which is the 14-35 that you use? I'm not familiar with that focal range.
Yeah, it was the replacement for the 16-35.
Oh, it's the new F4. I've gotcha. So there's a 15-35 2.8 and there's a 14-35 F4. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
So Ron, my husband, has the exact same set of gear, and his 14-35 seems a little bit sharper in the corners. Mine, I've had some issues with sharpness. So you have to be really careful with focusing, like wherever you're focusing close, and then focus stacking for really wide scenes. Because it's really cool to have a 14, but it's not, if you're doing like big prints, for web stuff, it's perfectly fine. But I've had to be a lot more careful with focusing. Like I got a little loosey-goosey with my 16-35 on my previous camera. This, I just have to be a lot more precise about my focusing.
So it's a bigger question. It sounds like you moved to mirrorless. Has that been a game changer for you? Would you ever go back? Is it just set in your mind as the way to go? And what do you feel like the obvious advantages since you moved to it?
I think it is absolutely the way to go. And like sometimes I'll see posts online saying, oh, like I don't think I'm nervous about moving to mirrorless, or I just don't think I'll like it. It's like, it's amazing. Like there are so many benefits that it's absolutely amazing. And I dropped my camera in a lake recently and had to go back to my DSLR, and experiencing like going from a mirrorless back to the DSLR. It's like, oh, no, I do not want to do this again. I'd say the two biggest things for me, the electronic viewfinder is just like being able to have the tools like a histogram and a level in the viewfinder, and then seeing exactly how the scene is going to be rendered. Focusing tools, other things in the viewfinder, I think just have streamlined my workflow a lot and helped me be more precise. And I try to be really precise in the field, like framing things up exactly, getting the exposure right. So that's really helped. And then with my type of photography, with intimate landscapes and abstracts, sometimes I'm doing all sorts of like pointing of 100 to 500 lens at a really steep angle, and you're never going to get that full scene in focus. So focus stacking, like the autofocus bracketing feature, has totally changed how I photograph, because
So good, isn't it?
like doing that manually, I used to do all that kind of thing manually with some scenes, but a lot of times I'd be like, this is too much work, I'm not going to do it. Now it happens so quickly that even if the subject is moving ever so slightly, or you only have a few seconds between a break in the wind, like that feature is just like, I focus stack all the time now and run it through Helicon Focus. It works 99% of the time. So those are the two biggest things related to my workflow with the Canon mirrorless system. So I sound like a salesperson. I sound like a Canon salesperson.
I'm
But
sold.
it's like, I feel like it's the perfect camera system for nature photographers. And there are only two tiny things I would change about the camera. So that's pretty good.
I'll ask you
What would you
about
change?
They're so small. Like the focus bracketing, you're limited to a 0.5 second
half of a second.
exposure.
Oh,
yeah,
so annoying, isn't
that's
it?
bizarre.
And
Yeah.
in the R7, they've eliminated that. So just do a firmware update and change it on the R5. And then on the histogram, so the histogram is up in the upper right corner, and there's a little return to focus button that is on the very edge of the red channel in the histogram. And it's like, that's one of the things I most want to see, is where the red channel is like leaving the right side of the histogram. And this stupid little button, you can't move it off of the screen. So,
All right, that one I hadn't noticed. The half a second one, I've hit my head against the wall a lot of times on that one, but at the same time, like Lukey was over my shoulder going, "You prick!" when that came out, and he didn't have it, but now he's got the benefit. He's a much happier man.
I'm a Sony shooter, and they only just only just came out with the A7R5. So, and up until that point, I was, not very happy about everyone else having it except for Sony. So it's their implementation's been really great. So certainly, it means you take a lot more photos, but you probably actually maybe you don't take as many, because you know you have a better confidence that what you're capturing when you are stacking is what you need. So yeah, no, it's a definitely a great innovation that they've got in these cameras. I'd love to see a focus bracketing exposure bracket as well.
yeah.
If they could do that, that would be nice. But
I noticed the really simple thing, like in Luke's system, it clearly defines the beginning and end of a focus stack, which you don't get with Canon. So I'm often like forgetting to, I'm not one of those stick a hand in front of the photos sort of type people and break it up. And sometimes I get back and go, oh, where did it start? Damn it. Little things make a big difference in terms of your workflow when you get back. But I'm with you. I'd never go back. I just had to put my iPhone in for repairs, and I had to go back to DSLRs, and I was just like, oh my God, bring me back.
Mhm.
I'm not going to go back, because I've been shooting mirrorless since about 2014, but we won't go there. Yeah, that's all good.
But, well, I feel like in some ways we don't even need to look at photographs, because it's been such a good interview so far. But it would be nice, given that we've got the opportunity to do it on
please.
It's totally up to you to where you want to start, Sarah. I feel like one of your great strengths and loves is the botanical world, and we've hinted at that, and we're talking about focus stacking. So maybe if you want to, that's somewhere we could maybe start.
Yeah, that sounds
And have
good.
you played with the new denoise in Lightroom, and what do you think?
Yeah, I think it seems like it. I will say I have not used Topaz or any of the other noise reduction software, so I can't comment on the comparison. But I think it's worked really well. Like with fine details, I think it's like it seems to preserve the details significantly better than like just the standard Lightroom denoise. So my experience so far has been positive.
Yeah, I've just started using it too and been pretty happy. It's pretty good for Astro sort of type stuff in particular. It's often some of the other softwares they might do the noise down, but you really take a hit on the detail or the minute sort of contrast level or even the sharpening aspects of it. And they seem to have done a lot better job of incorporating both. So here we go, folks. Oh my goodness, where do we
Okay,
start?
photos.
Yeah.
So before we talk about plant photos, I will show that I do landscape photography too.
Oh,
so
please.
don't want to box myself into just plants.
No. I just thought it was an obvious place to start. We can go wherever you are.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about plant photography. I can point out a few of these that are focus stacked that like would not have been possible without, or would have been supremely tedious. So pretty much like the first three are focus stacks. This one, whoops. So this one here, this is a very rare poppy in Death Valley National Park. And I'm going to move my screen over here so I'm not talking to my other monitor. Sorry about that.
That's all good.
I think that'll be.
Oh, we can still see your desktop at the moment. So
okay.
You might have, yeah.
I will fix it. I just don't want to be talking to.
Sorry
that I'm making an edit thing for you, but I just didn't. I didn't want to be talking to my other monitor the whole time.
I noticed that there was a very distinct color palette there too across all images as well. A very sort of like purpley, maybe like a greeny. I don't know if that's just my perception there or not. Are they a sort of a preference in terms of a color combination that you really enjoy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I'm very careful about like I generally want to go much more to the cooler side of things.
Yeah.
Consistently.
Yeah, I noticed that too. And I guess one thing that people might not be aware of is the amount of effort you've put into the botanical knowledge. Like I was reading one of your posts of how you actually did a huge amount of research to actually find out where the plant would even be in terms of where it exists in nature and the kind of ecosystems and little places. Like I think it's one thing to just come across plants; it's another to actually know what you're looking for and try and find certain things and know where to look.
Yeah, I can actually talk a little bit about that with this particular photo. So this photo it's of a rare poppy that grows particularly in limestone soils or limestone canyons within Death Valley National Park. And Guy Tao has taken a photo of these plants before, and I was just absolutely fascinated with them. His views are totally different than this. So you wouldn't necessarily look at one of his photos and then look at my photo and say, oh, that's the same plant. So I did want to do something different than what he had presented. But this particular plant, it required me so I started with iNaturalist, which is a really helpful app here in North America, where you can essentially zoom in on a particular region, search for a particular species, and then zoom in on a specific part of a map. And then I found a couple of these plants located within a few different canyons. And then I looked in some guidebooks and some other things. And I figured out 5 or 6 places where I thought they might grow in the park. And then we went hiking and drove 3 hours into the backcountry on crazy dirt, rough roads, hiked into 2 different canyon systems, and miraculously they were growing in the wash of a particular canyon. So it's that learning about the plant, where it grows, or having the curiosity to want to find it, first of all, and then learning about the ecosystem that it grows in, putting some tools to work. So things like iNaturalist and other apps, field guides, that kind of thing. And then actually putting in the time on the ground to find it. So this one felt like Guy Tao, he sparked the interest in the plant for me. And then I put in a lot of work to actually find it. So that one felt pretty good. this is a focus stack of 15 images. So macro lens, really close. This is a very small subject. And then like focusing on the closest thing, running the focus stacking series, and then blending them all in Helicon focus. And that's one of the benefits of Helicon focus is you see all these lines, the little crazy hairs on each of these individual leaves. That's something that if I had manually done a focus stack, I could easily have missed a plane of focus, and the photo wouldn't have worked as well, or there would have been a technical issue. So that's where the autofocus bracketing really helped.
And I'm assuming for a scene like this too, you want to make sure that the lighting's very soft and there's not much wind or anything like that. So you still need some special conditions, I suppose, to make that work.
Yeah, exactly. So in the particular situation with this, we were in a canyon with reflected light that was reflecting onto the plant. So it's very subtle light, but you can tell. I don't know if I have any others of that plant in this gallery. I don't think that I do. Amazing. But it's like the light, you could tell as the light was moving down the side of the canyon that the light was changing on this one little tiny plant. So being observant about light is just as important for something like a tiny photograph of a plant.
And would you consider using a reflector or maybe even a strobe or something to alter the light, or do you almost, is it almost like a personal rule to stick with the natural lighting?
So I don't use anything unnatural except for a diffuser or my coat. So those would be the only two. Like I will modify the light by like wrapping my coat around my legs and creating shade, or holding a diffuser over to create a little bit of shade. So a lot of these, like this was a coat specialty. So creating like holding my coat over because I don't always bring my gear that I should bring with me.
No spray cans for the water, Sarah?
It's a spray bottle, yeah.
No, this is absolutely 100% rain.
Yeah, nice.
So my idea about nature photography is like what inspires me to get out is things coming together, like all the elements aligning. And in this particular case, one of those elements is rain. So I generally don't do very much processing. I make some creative choices, of course, but I'm not doing any heavy processing. I'm not bringing glycerin or water. I'm not using artificial lighting like a flash or anything like that. Because as I talked about earlier, part of the reason I do this is because it's hard. And so having like the water droplets on this corn lily, that like all of those things coming together, finding the three that were interacting with each other, surrounded by the rest that were looking good. They weren't tattered by wind or hail, so they looked good. It had just rained. It was soft, overcast light from my coat. I think it just like all of those things coming together. That's why I do nature photography. So
that is one of the things, isn't it? You can have all of the conditions aligned, but then you can't find an actual specimen that's kind of photogenic, and you don't want to have to do all this post-processing to fix what a plant is in its natural state. So sometimes that's the hardest thing, is just finding your actual subject in the chaos. Yeah. Exactly.
So these are the photos that you see here. This is one approach that I take to plant photography. And I would consider these more portraits of plants. So you can still tell exactly what you're looking at. You know that you're generally looking at plants. In terms of composition, I'm relying a lot on repetition, patterns, simplification, feeling like the subject expands on every side of the frame and then it continues on the outside of the frame. So that's generally what I'm thinking about for this particular collection. You can see that I have a fascination with repetition and patterns. But then I also do a totally different type of work with my plant photography.
Would that set mainly be with a macro lens that you've got there?
I was going to ask you about focal length.
No. So I could go through and talk a little bit about lens choice. So this was a 24-105, probably on the wider end of things. This was probably like a 50 millimeter. Oh, wow. This was a 100 millimeter macro lens.
What apertures are you running your focus stacking with?
It totally depends. Like this one was probably like an f16 type of situation because it was a tiny subject. I'm really close. versus where this is a focus stack. So this would be a 500 millimeter lens pointing at a really steep angle, so that first lily pad that's closest to me is close, and then the one that's furthest away is pretty far away. And that steep angle then means that I'm going to need quite a few files and more
like
depth
20
of
or
field
so.
for each of those files.
Yeah, that's
so this would be an example
Ben
of
does a lot. Our co-host, what is those sort of compressed focus stacks?
Yeah. So like a 500 millimeter lens on that one is really handy versus this is water lilies too. And that's probably like facing straight down on the edge of a pond. And that's probably more like a mid-range, like a 35, 50. Of course, I'm guessing at all these just based on memory. But so that would be two subjects photographed in a completely different way, or these two that are next to each other. This is going to be like I was laying out over this pool, hand holding, like not even looking through the viewfinder. And this, I think, was probably closer to 25. And then I zoomed in to isolate this, same kind of thing, holding my camera out over the pool without looking at through the viewfinder. And this was probably a 105. So
Isn't
the
that
same
amazing?
subject, but treated a different
Mosaic.
way.
How much is handheld and how much is tripod based generally with these sort of shots, Sarah?
99% is tripod because I have the least steady hands of anyone alive. So I have some colleagues who can handhold for macro work, and I wish I had that skill because it does open up all sorts of opportunities. But I unfortunately do not have that skill. So
probably better to write that off too, because the frustration of trying to make a stack work or something like that, if you're hand holding, it would just be a nightmare.
Yeah, especially for something like a really detailed subject like this, where like there are just so many intersecting lines that there would be no saving it. I will highlight one other one on here about just due to depth of field. So this was a hybrid approach of where I was using a really long lens. So I took this probably with a 400 millimeter lens. Since it's a couple of years old, I'm assuming it was my 100 to 400. And I wanted, so this is a focus stack, but it's just focus stacked for that band of corn lilies that you see in the middle, because I just wanted those sharp. And then the foreground is soft and then the background is soft. So this is more where I still want the soft depth of field, the shallow depth of field close to me and far away from me, but then have that little band of focus in the middle. So that's probably 3 or 4 files just blended for that middle part. So
do you have a formula? Because this is a personal and technical question I'm still trying to figure out. Where is it? Do you have a kind of rough formula in terms of the focal length you use, the aperture you use relative to the number of focus stacks that you need to achieve front to back? Because I'm still trying to figure out, like, how many shots do I need?
I think that's what the camera does, though. I think that's part of the algorithm in the actual focus stack mechanism of the camera. I think it's why Sony took so long to develop it, was that it takes into account, well, it's like the circle of confusion or whatever, based on all of the aperture and compression that you have, and it sort of makes its best guess based on that. But I don't know how you do that manually.
The R5, you've got to put it in yourself, don't you? Is my understanding. You've got to choose the number of stacks.
Yeah,
I thought you choose how much deep, like how like it's more like not a choice of the number of shots, but a choice of how aggressive it should be and how many shots it takes. Don't know if that's accurate or not.
Yeah, you have to choose a number, is my understanding, and then there's a sliding scale of the increments of change between them. How would you describe it, Sarah?
Yeah, so the camera settings, I think, are so getting used to the camera settings, and it sounds like the Sony is quite a bit different in terms of the interface. So it doesn't seem like we can necessarily come to any consistency about the technical side, because with the Canon R5 implementation, at least, you have a continuum of essentially narrow to wide. And I'm assuming that, or from what I understand, it's like how wide is the band of focus? And I always go to the more narrow side. So I think I have mine set at 2 or 3, and I generally get pretty good results. So that's the technical side, like that's learning how the interface works. And then I think the other more complicated thing is experience of knowing a scene and then getting a sense of, like, I think that I probably just need 2 or 3 files versus like I'm using a very long lens, so something like a 500 millimeter lens, and then knowing that I'm pointed at a very steep diagonal to my subject, and that really steep approach means that depth of field is going to be even more complicated. So those bands of focus are really, really narrow. One of the ways that when I'm teaching focus stacking is to think about using focus peaking. So if you're using a mirrorless camera that has focus peaking, you can turn on the focus peaking, choose your aperture, and then is your band of focus really narrow or is it wide? Because if it's super narrow, you know you're going to need more files. You can get a sense of like how many files is it going to take to get from front to back and have everything in between be sharp. So if you see that, let's say you're photographing something pointing down, maybe doing an abstract or something like that, where you're pointing down at the ground, and you can tell that your subject falls off just a little bit in the left corner. It's a little bit lower than everything else. Then your focus peaking will tell you that 95% of the frame is going to be in focus with one file, and then you're just going to have to get something for that lower edge. Or if you have a subject with a lot of topography, and you see that there's just a tiny band of focus, you're going to realize, oh, I'm actually probably going to need 5 to 15 files. So that's the tool that if you have a mirrorless camera that I find to be most helpful, is the focus peaking will help you make that decision.
Yeah, and it's the other thing is it's really misleading too, because it's not linear. So, if you've got something really close to the subject, very close to the lens, and it's sort of the focus field is fading out, you might have to take 5 shots just for the first meter, and then it goes out from there. So it can be deceptive in terms of how many close shots you actually need to make it work, depending on your focal length and aperture and those sort of things. So it's definitely a very tricky skill to get right, I suppose, and probably take more shots than you need just so that you have them there. It's nothing worse than having a missed file and it just the photo won't work then, unfortunately.
Yeah, experiment before you go on a big trip, and then put all your eggs in the focus stacking basket because you don't want to come home with a bunch of mistakes. Like one of the hardest backpacking trips I've done. So I think, Paul, you mentioned earlier that we've been exploring all these canyons in Death Valley, and we're up to 74. I'm up to 74.
Wow.
And one of the hardest backpacking trips we've done, because we had to carry our water, it was essentially hiking across Death Valley and then up an alluvial fan into a canyon. And it ended up being, I think, 13 miles, carrying all of our water in a day in hot weather by the time we got to this canyon. And then we hiked into 3 different canyons while we were there. One of them was incredible. I used focus stacking with my R5 on my 14 to 35, thinking everything will work perfectly, and then hiked out. So like a very hard hike, given the amount of carrying water and camera gear across the open desert is a challenging hike. Go to focus stack those files and they're messed up. It's like, it would be hard to get back there. And I screwed it up because I hadn't experimented with my 14 to 35 yet. And now I know that using that lens at f8 and then doing a lot of focus stacks so that the close things that I have lots of slices for the close corners because I was in a narrow enclosure like a canyon where you have lots of close things on the sides. It's like that's a lesson I wish I had learned before I was trying to implement that technical workflow in a place that's hard to get back to. So that was one of my main disappointments of the last year or so.
Sarah, I feel like do you want to have free reign about maybe what images or style of photography you want to share from now? Like I know I suggested the plant thing, but it's sort of anywhere you want to go, either black and white or grand or any particular place you want to explore, feel free to just have fun with it.
Maybe even the work that the work that you connect with the most at the moment, and the kind of work you'd like to do more of in the future would be really interesting too.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. I can quickly go through. I will quickly show a totally different approach to plant photography, because that is something that I'm doing a lot of right now. So if you see the portraits of plants, those are very obvious. You know that they're plants. I wouldn't call them documentary, but they're more obvious versus
A
this
little more descriptive than abstract. Yeah.
like this more abstract. And I'm taking subjects that if you saw with your own eye, you might not see them. The camera transforms them in some way. So this is a good example. This is a salsify. And a salsify is like a gigantic dandelion seed head. So it's probably like 2.5 inches around with all these little seed pods coming out. And this is something that, if at least in where I live in Colorado, they're considered an invasive weed. So people pick them. Some people forage them and eat them because the roots are edible. But generally, if you were walking by this, you would not necessarily picture this as being the resulting photograph. But when you get really close to a small subject like this and you focus well into the subject, you can create a completely different abstract rendition. So when I'm teaching macro photography or plant photography, one of the things that I see people do a lot is they focus on the thing that is closest to them. And that leaves out a whole lot of opportunities if instead you're focusing more into your subject. So by focusing through the subject, I'm getting that really dreamy look. It's transforming it to look significantly more abstract. And sometimes you get colors that you don't necessarily see with your eye. So that's a totally different type of photography that I'm doing with plants.
You mentioned that one was a weed as such. Just knowing how naturalists think and that kind of thing, do you ever get people commenting, why'd you photograph that? That's not a native species at all, or what have you?
Well, they grow in my yard and I live in a pretty natural setting. So I feel like, yes, I think my answer to that would be that I want to look for beauty everywhere. I have another example that I can show of that, of where I want to be as open-minded as possible when I go out into the natural world. And part of that is seeing opportunities in all sorts of weird subjects. Like here, this is kind of a scummy section of a lake, but I thought the light on these reeds or grasses was particularly interesting. So this is something that at first glance, it kind of looks like a scummy pond, but I feel like I was happy with the light and the pattern coming together with a long telephoto lens. So this would also be a focus stack with a 500mm lens. I have a lot of the scummy pond photos, and like this is a scummy pond. This was one of my favorite photos that I took from the Adirondack Mountains from my fall colors trip 2 years ago. And I feel like this is a great example of where you see potential in every subject. I liked the bands of the green algae, the pine needles, and then the colorful leaves scattered about. So seeing potential in a lot of different subjects. And then there was a photo in here. Oh, this one. This is absolutely all about seeing opportunity. So this is a dormant plant in Death Valley National Park. And of all of the photos that I've shared online, this is probably the one I get the most questions about, because people just don't know what they're looking at. And in this particular case, it's just seeing a dormant plant. So something that most people would just hike by without a second look, and thinking, I'm actually going to stop and look at it. And then once I'm looking at it, I'm seeing, oh, this actually has a really interesting network look to it. That's kind of unusual. You have the white twigs on the colorful rocks in the background. So you have some natural contrast there. So it's seeing opportunities in kind of mundane subjects and then presenting them in a whole portfolio, because I feel like this is the type of photo that on its own might not necessarily be that interesting. But then when you present it as a collection of finding order in chaos, so the theme of this portfolio is order from chaos. And that's one of the things that I find most exciting in going out into the natural world is being surrounded by a very chaotic environment and simplifying it down to patterns and repetition and the little nuances that come together to create an ecosystem. So I know the two of you do a lot of really big landscapes. This is distilling down those big landscapes into individual subjects and then presenting them in this type of collection to tell a different kind of story about the landscape.
It's fantastic.
How much do you feel like curation plays a role in your photographic life?
I would say that curation is a huge part of what I'm doing, because like the photos that you see here, the way that I'm presenting my work. So the first section I have on my website, these are all curated collections, except for the recent additions. That's more based on time. But these are, let me see if I can zoom out to get all of these on one page. So these are the main themes of my work. So I'm wandering the desert. I enjoy photographing at very early twilight and very late twilight. So that's the glow about the land. Quiet time is quiet scenes in autumn, springtime. So when we have those really vibrant greens of spring and summer. Parting gifts would be twilight landscapes at twilight. I like really soft light. So this is an example of a lot of this kind of light is something that a lot of nature photographers are going to say, this is boring. Like, this is the worst light. It's not even worth taking out my camera. And I really like that soft rendition. I like the landscape looking very calm and soft and quiet. So I pursue this kind of light and I absolutely love it. I never say there's bad light because I always can find something to photograph. And sometimes this really misty or overcast or quiet light is some of my favorite light. And then I'm going to be doing things like this Connections and the Order Among Chaos portfolio. Both of these are collections of patterns and repetition. One is more cool toned, one is more warm toned. And then these three last portfolios are all different ways of looking at plants. So this is how I curate my main portfolios. And then I have all of my black and white work, which we can talk a little bit about. And then I have by location and theme.
I'm interested. I'm a big fan of infrared. Have you ever played with infrared in black and white photography at all?
I should. Like, I don't have a good reason. I haven't though. Yeah. Have either of you guys?
Yeah, I've been shooting infrared for quite a few years, and yeah, it's a nice departure from what you traditionally do, because you basically are forcing yourself to photograph in black and white permanently, but also it does transform the landscape, and so the greens in the trees are vibrant white, and you can kind of engender different scenes that look very different and much more dramatic, I feel, if you have the right conditions. So it's definitely if you kind of like feel like you're getting stuck in patterns or want to take it in a different direction, it's definitely a good thing to try. And also with mirrorless cameras now, the bodies aren't very big, and so you can actually conceivably have an infrared camera always in your bag, and you can just pull that out whenever the situation arises. So I'll quite often hike with my infrared body, which is just an A7R, which is quite a small little camera. And sometimes I don't use it at all, and sometimes I'll use it 75%, even up to 100% of the time, depending on what's happening. So it's but it's definitely always something I advocate people give a go.
Like our conversation at the very beginning of like, do you focus on things and try to pursue like and finish projects, or do you indulge your like a range of interests? And that's where it's like, I've always been fascinated with infrared, but I can't get through the photos that I take.
Yes.
So I think that's been the main barrier, but I'm going to file that away. Another recommendation for infrared.
Yeah, I think it's more, it's not so much replacing or it's more just we talk about adaptability, and so sometimes the scenes just conditions that aren't great for general landscape scenes can be really transformed in like during the middle of the day. And so in some I guess what you're saying is it's just going to throw more on the backlog, which is also it's a massive drama that I have too. Mine's years in going behind. I've been doing a lot of curation on my backlog, but I haven't done a lot of processing on it. So yeah, it's definitely I feel your pain there for sure. And a lot of my backlog is infrared images. So that's a very good point.
Sarah, I wonder, we just hinted at black and white. Black and white is certainly how I was first introduced to your work, and it seems it's been a very big part of your life. And I wonder, because we don't have a huge amount of time, what we want to spend the time on, but I'm quite curious about who has influenced you and what has shaped your viewing, and how much of it has been just your own independent, isolated journey, and how much of it has been bouncing off certain people in your career, and even now, and maybe where you're heading. Are there certain people that whose work you're drawn to, or that shapes the way you think?
Yeah, and first I will mention we're having a crazy windstorm, so I don't know if my microphone is picking up any of the
Not at
banging
all.
around.
Yeah,
So I
Zoom
apologize
noise
if it
reduction is
is.
doing its job at the moment.
Yeah, it's springtime in our area. Like the wind coming through is just insane. So my apologies. In terms of influence, when I look at my work, my initial work was very much what I'm doing now. So I was interested in plants. I was drawn to patterns, more telephoto landscapes. So those were the things. If I were to pull up my first year or two of photography, those would be the things that you would see. They aren't very refined. I didn't know what I was doing. My compositions were terrible. Lighting was awful, but those were you could see the sparks. And so I would consider that to be kind of my most authentic voice. And then I started participating in online photography communities. And I think that kind of naturally got drawn into like the things that are eye-catching, which was like the Mark Adamus style landscapes. So I started pursuing that almost exclusively, where it was like foreground, big background, big sky. And that was I probably was doing that for 3 or 4 years, and I was not finding any satisfaction in it. I would occasionally feel like, oh, I like this photo, but it never really felt like me. It definitely felt like I was looking for external validation. I was looking for positive comments in the forums where I was sharing my work or from peers. But a lot of the things like the planning conversation that we had earlier, like being very planning oriented, being very expectation oriented, it just wasn't feeling right. So when we started traveling in our Airstream, we went from chasing the light, going full speed ahead, 100, like if the sunset isn't happening where we are at, we're going to drive 200 miles to see if we can catch it where the weather might be better. So Ron and I were doing that, all with a focus on ground landscapes. And then we bought our Airstream and we stayed in Zion National Park for 3 weeks for the first time. And that was the first time I had ever stayed in a place for more than a day at a time, really. I was constantly bouncing around, doing way too much. And actually being in a place for an extended period of time, I think was revelatory, and it kind of brought me back to where I was. And I think at that point, that's where some of the photography influences started coming more into play. So I would say people like Charles Kramer, that he was probably the biggest influence, the first person whose work I saw where he was doing, like he was dedicating his life to intimate landscapes. And then I would say the other person that's probably had the biggest influence on me was Guy Tal. And that's not necessarily just his photography, but also some of his writing came at really critical times. Like he has this one particular essay that's essentially like, you only live once, so why are you waiting to make these big choices about your life? Like, do it now. And so like I moved, I got a divorce, I moved, like I changed all sorts of things about my life in response to some of his writing. It's way more complicated than that, but his thinking around a lot of things related to nature photography, like 5 to 10 years ago, his writing was incredibly influential. And then he's also doing intimate landscapes. So I'd say that those are the two people who had the most influence directly. And then I think just being part of the community of like Alex Noriega, he's somebody that I've spent quite a bit of time with, actually out photographing, and Alex and my husband Ron, like being around them has taught me a lot about light. I think I see light much differently as a result of being around the two of them. So that's something that's kind of hard to encapsulate, but now has really influenced my work because I think I'm a lot more observant about light. So I'd say those are a couple of examples. I always feel like these are hard discussions because I don't want to leave anybody out. But
Yeah.
generally, I'd say those would be a couple of examples of people who have influenced my work.
How would you describe the NPN? Like, what sort of role? What is it? And it's quite a big sort of institution in America. And do you want to speak a little bit about to that? Because that might be something our audience is a bit unfamiliar with.
Yeah, the Nature Photographers Network, which is that forum that I was talking about, where I started years ago, that encouraged me to kind of change my style. It's been sold to somebody else now. David Kingham is the main person that oversees it, and he co-owns it with his partner, Jennifer. And David and Jennifer, I think their vision has been to create the Nature Photographers Network as a place where photographers can gather and get thoughtful feedback on their photography in a way that helps propel them forward. So I would say for my own work years ago, NPN was one of the most influential sources of learning. I learned so much about processing, about composition, how to be focused more on details, like how to refine a photograph. Like that was something that I didn't learn on my own. I learned that from reading through many critiques on NPN. And I think that experience early on really helped me become a better photographer. So now I don't really want critique on my work, so I don't post my work for that purpose on NPN anymore. But for people who are feeling like they want some feedback, but they're not really getting it, they're from a place like Instagram or just posting on social media, NPN can be a great place to go to get really thoughtful feedback on your work from other experienced photographers, nature photographers in particular.
Is it accessible internationally, or is it just US focused? Or
Yeah, it's totally open to international, and it's there are bird and wildlife forums, some plant and macro photography, ground landscapes, intimate landscapes. So pretty much the full range of nature photography. It's a very welcoming community, and I can say based on my experience that it was such a helpful place to be at that particular time in my development. So if anybody watching this is looking for a place to share their work and get some really thoughtful feedback, I think it's a fantastic investment. They also have Ask Me Anything forums where you can ask professional photographers questions, and I find those to be really insightful. And they also do some webinars and have a lot of really deep bank of articles that I think are higher quality than you can necessarily find in some other places. So definitely recommend NPN.
yeah, and I appreciate that because we don't really have access to anything down here with any of that level of breadth and interactivity at all. In fact, we've lost in Australia, we lost our overriding photographic body even. So it's an interesting time in our community in terms of where we look to for that kind of level of feedback on our work and connectivity as a community. The other thing, Sarah, I wanted to really talk to you about is your role in co-founding the Nature First Photography Alliance and where that sits in your life and what aspirations you have for it and maybe the purpose and intention behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually created upstairs. So in my living room, right above us is where a group of Colorado-based photographers came together to create the Nature First organization. So I helped write the principles. So there are 7 principles for essentially being a responsible photographer and thinking about stewardship. Like that nature photography is not just about the ends. It's also about the process. So the result is what you show online, but there's a lot that goes into your practices of creating that photograph and then how you talk about your photography when you post it online. So I'm not directly involved in Nature First anymore, but I as one of the people who is responsible for founding the organization and then actually creating the principles, I absolutely practice them. And I try to include information about nature first in everything that I do. So as an example, location sharing is one of the principles that if you're going to share locations, do it with discretion. And I recently published an ebook on Death Valley National Park that is a location guide. And I tried to infuse nature first principles in every aspect of creating that location guide. So from the very first page, talking about how this is a landscape that deserves to be protected, to going into the nature first principles, listing them, and then in every relevant location, talking about the sensitivities of the place that you're visiting. Because often I think people think of the desert as a resilient place. Well, in some cases, like if you walk into a field of wildflowers or you walk across a mud flat and you leave footprints, like those footprints might be there a decade later if rain doesn't come, or if you're trampling wildflowers, they might never grow in that place again. And those are things that people visiting a landscape for the first time don't necessarily know. So nature first principles, like I felt comfortable sharing common locations, but I also wanted to do it responsibly. So that means I'm sharing that information about how to be a good steward, and then also leaving out some locations. So making the decision that some places are too sensitive and that I shouldn't be part of sharing that information online. So just generally, I think that the basis behind the entire nature first idea is that we as nature photographers, say 10 years ago, were a force for good. Now that's a really questionable proposition. In a lot of places, we're not a force for good. We draw people to locations. The way we present information is sometimes very irresponsible. Sometimes we ourselves behave in irresponsible ways. And we as a community, because we need nature to do what we do, we need it to be a reciprocal relationship. We need to treat the natural world with respect, and we need to communicate that when we're sharing our photographs so that people understand a little bit more about the context and they themselves can also treat the place responsibly.
It is an interesting concept that it's not just about how you behave when you're actually out in the field, but it's also, one of the principles of leave no traces, actually to not leave traces on social media as well. And it's often where things fall over and cause the most problem is how you communicate and talk about places online. So yeah, it's definitely really good to have some principles and a place that people can go to understand the best way to hold themselves, I suppose, in these special places.
Yeah, I think we're an organization like that really serves its purpose beautifully. Is it's a place you can go to understand the really actionable approach to these principles, and not just ideas. They're actually fleshed them out in terms of your everyday sort of reality, in terms of how you can place yourself in a responsible position with that. I mean, we spent a lot of time thinking about that with this show as well, Sarah, because we have done location oriented shows, and we do have social media presence as well, and we've been landscape shooters for a long time, and there's a lot of areas in Tasmania that are particularly sensitive in the alpine areas, and 60% of the flora and fauna found in those areas is found nowhere else on the planet, and a lot of it is very very sensitive and very easily damaged. And there's an example of a place just up the road from my house that was posted out on Instagram, and within 6 months it was basically destroyed. And so it's a very real part of a responsible landscape photographer's approach to what they do, particularly in a professional realm when you start getting a profile. But I think we all have the potential to do that. We all have a potential online voice, and I think it's well worth being very present to that reciprocal nature of that relationship, even if it's a very even personal spiritual thing where you're just very thankful and grateful for the well-being and the joy and the balance and the perspective you get from your time in nature. And I think the more you get into that and the more you do that, the more you gain from that in your life. It's a wonderful thing to slow down and think, well, how can I acknowledge that in a way, or give back in a way, or be a voice to that natural world that may need it or may benefit from it. And yeah, it's a principle I think all three of us share. And it's a powerful thing to be the advocate and be writing the framework for that kind of structure, Sarah. That must have taken a lot of time and reflection and nuance to kind of filter that down into the overriding principles.
Yeah, and I would say that I think one of the most disappointing experiences related to it is that a lot of nature photographers just don't see their responsibility. Like it is a very transactional relationship. And I think that that's, I don't know that I have any conclusion other than like that. I think sometimes I do feel pretty disappointed in our field as a whole, that we aren't generally bigger voices for conservation, bigger voices for environmental justice, and just in the most basic ways that we behave as nature photographers, like that. Like if you're trampling a field of wildflowers to get a photo, like that's being irresponsible. And the fact that this is controversial or that not everybody can get on board, I think has been a little bit distressing.
Yeah. Have you moved away from that role just to focus on your business, or any other particular reason? Or
Yeah, I think that it was just that I was there for the time to do some of the writing, and then the organization became a lot more formal with a formal structure, and I'm kind of done with the nonprofit world. Like I did that for years as a career. I'm not really interested in. I'm more interested in advocating for these ideas rather than creating a structure to run an organization. So it's just like moving on. And I feel like I'm hoping that by infusing it in everything that I do, that I'm still active in promoting the ideas, even if I'm not actually part of the specific organization.
well, I think the legacy comes to mind a little bit, just to hint at where I'd like to go with the rest of the conversation. In terms of, I mean, that's a legacy that you've had that role, and a very significant one, and planting those seeds and creating that structure and kind of isolating those principles into a very accessible sort of form. And then I noticed you talked about your focus coming up on books. Like I'm trying to think, not that it's necessarily a personal motivation, but it's an element of being a photographer, a full-time photographer with a career in it, is what do you want to leave behind? How do you want to your voice to be heard? What are the qualities or characteristics or elements of your work that you love people to reflect on or be present to, in your place and role as an influential photographer in particular? Do you want to speak to that a little bit more, and maybe where you're heading with that?
Yeah, I think that's such a hard question because I don't want to see myself as a narcissist, like thinking
I know,
that.
but it's a wonderful thing to play around with. Just treat it as a playful conversation. What would be
Yeah.
great? What would be cool? It's not so much about your ego, but I guess we all have our aims and dreams and aspirations. Maybe aspirations might be a better way to look at it.
Well, that's one of the things that like I have been tossing around. Like, why do I think that I have that what I have to say is worth being put into book form? So that's something that I've just been tossing around for myself. It's like, what exactly is my motivation to do this? And I think I have come to the conclusion that I feel like I do have a few unique approaches in the world of nature photography, and that it's worth documenting those and sharing those in a form that's more than an ebook on my website, or more than a blog post, or more than a conversation like this. So one of the themes that we've been talking about a lot throughout this entire conversation is how I do feel like a lot of the nature photography culture, at least in the United States, I'd be interested to hear if you guys agree based on the culture that you're part of. But the culture in the United States is, I think it's in some ways confining, and it's often the advice that people receive. It's constraining, and it makes our world smaller. So from the moment that you start in as a nature photographer, a lot of the messages that you're receiving is that there's a right way and a wrong way to do composition. There's good light and there's bad light, and you shouldn't photograph when there's bad light, that there are good subjects and bad subjects, and good places and boring places, and that you shouldn't photograph, like you should never do things like center your subject. You should never photograph under bad light. You shouldn't go to these boring places. You need to go to the impressive places, and you need to photograph them under the very best light. And all of those things are, I think, making the world smaller, and they're, I think, confining, they're taking away opportunity instead of creating opportunity. So the whole idea of learning to be adaptable, learning to see opportunities in every landscape, to start with curiosity and see where your curiosity leads you, instead of just being like, I just want to copy a composition that I saw on Instagram. That this more expansive approach, I do think, at least in the United States, is a more unique approach to photography. And I think it can bring joy to people who may not be finding joy in a more traditional approach. So that's the message that I feel like I want to convey in this educational book that I'm working on, which is all about intimate landscapes, photographs of plants, and abstracts, so smaller scenes. And so that's my first project. And then my second project started out as an idea of like a Death Valley portfolio book, and it's morphed more into an appreciation for the Death Valley landscape through the lens of why it's important to conserve the rest of the Mojave Desert. Because the Mojave Desert, which is essentially like Southern California with some fringes into other areas, but it's industrial solar, lithium mining, and some other extractive industries are dramatically changing the character of the Mojave Desert. So Death Valley is protected, and it's an amazing place. So what can we learn from the fact that it's been protected, and apply those same protections to the public lands that are on the fringe of that community, or on the fringe of that protected public land? So what was supposed to just be a portfolio book is now turning hopefully more into a conservation message about why it's important to preserve this landscape. So when I look at those two projects, those are the next two things I want to do. I feel like both of those are unique views that I have on the world. So I'd like to hold a book with those ideas and those photographs in it. And I don't know about legacy. Like, I think that's too far off, but I do know that I want to bring my work into a more concrete form. So that's what I'd like the focus for the next 2 or 3 years to be. A long circular way of getting to an answer to your question.
Well,
But
it's a big question, and I probably didn't frame it in a way that was as accessible as it could be. But I guess, you know, when you've been shooting for a long time, it's kind of like, you know, occasionally I think, well, why am I doing this, and what am I doing it for? And is there a way that this can be beyond me, not just about me? And so it's taking that time to reflect about those motivations can have its own influence on the compass of where you go, and why you do what you do, and what you then apply yourself to. And I think, you know, over here in Tasmania, we have a very, very strong, very, very clear lineage of conservation-based photographers that have done incredibly powerful work. So in some ways it's laid bare around us, and it's evidenced everywhere, and it's a huge part of the culture here. And you can't really be a part of this culture without being influenced by it. And if you step out of line in terms of that role, people will pull you back in, you know, quite unashamedly. And so it has a bit more of a purist kind of let nature be the hero sort of type focus, as opposed to, you know, us waving our magic wands as being amazing photographers, and, you know, and just shaping it how we want to see it. It's a little bit different. And I think where you are influences how you shoot, which I think is a whole nother conversation itself. But I think it is appropriate. I think if you're spending your whole life dedicated to a craft, you know, where do you want to be positioned when you're gone? Looking back, what qualities or characteristics would you love to have left behind? And it's not necessarily about an ego approach. It's just about an opportunity.
I think it's like the 10,000-foot view, really, isn't it? It's like, what am I actually doing here, and you know, what am I working towards, with all of that opportunity and all of those things that you can be doing? How are they all sort of interrelating with each other, and where am I ending up with all of that? So it's much more of a, you know, it's a very constructive thing to think about, isn't it?
I think the fact that you're like how you're talking about conservation and nature photography being so much more integrated, I think that's definitely something that's so different in the US culture. Of there's nature, or there's landscape photography over here, and there's conservation photography over here, and there are a few people that might have some overlap. But if you're going to do conservation related work, you are a conservation photographer. And the community like, I don't think the community is particularly welcoming to people who don't do just conservation photography. So like I'm trying to figure out how I can bridge that more. And it's really hard to know how to do that. So just because I think like I came up in the culture of nature photography, I feel like that's a very meaningful pursuit and I get a lot of personal satisfaction out of it. And I find teaching to be very fulfilling. Like I feel like that hopefully is one of my current smaller legacies of just like helping people find their way and take their work to that next step. But more recently, as I've gotten more interested in conservation and environmental issues, it's like transferring those skills to be a conservation photographer. There's no natural path in the United States. It's like it's either or. So that's actually been something I've been thinking about a lot and struggling with because I don't have a good answer because so few people do both in a way. Like you're part of one community or the other generally.
There is a bit of that perception. I've actually been even bullied by people in the conservation photography side in the past. So there's definitely some level of tension, and I don't know if you'd say it's a turf kind of scenario, but it definitely you feel sometimes like you're operating in a space where you don't know if you have even permission to be in. So I don't know if that's exactly how you're sort of discussing it, but I've definitely it doesn't seem to be just a US thing. I've certainly experienced aspects of that myself, and it would be nice to have a more straightforward way to contribute to that kind of conversation or conservation as well, without having to feel like you're needing to morph into another form or something like that.
Yeah, good point. Look, I think for myself, if you don't mind me chiming in, I think the fallback for all of that is if you remove politics and groups and the human element, the modeling that you do yourself as an individual is the most paramount thing you can do. You know, the sensitivity around locations, the educational aspect of letting people know if you're in certain areas or shooting certain subjects, then using that as an opportunity to educate people about what's important or delicate or sensitive about those things. You can all do that yourself, completely independent of that whole wider conversation in terms of what you shoot, how you talk about what you shoot, you know, the modeling of how you do it, you know, to your clients or on your workshops. Like that's probably the most powerful thing you can do anyway. And then you can put outside the complexity of politics that just happens with any sort of part of human nature that involves larger groups with certain intentions that may not match. That's kind of my personal fallback, Sarah, because I feel like it's a bit too hard sometimes to navigate that whole bigger picture sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And it's something that I've been thinking about, just like how I talk about my photos and how I label myself. Is like I don't need somebody else's permission to say that I'm working in conservation photography. And if I start talking, if I make a deliberate effort to start infusing more conservation minded, naturalist minded information in my work, I think I can make that claim. It's just something that I think I was just waiting for permission from somebody to say, like, or a path, like this is how a nature photographer can also identify themselves as a conservation photographer. It's so strange about how it feels like this is one of the last areas, at least in the US, where it does feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping, and it just doesn't necessarily to me make a lot of sense. So it's like, stop waiting for permission, stop waiting for a title, and just like what you're suggesting, Paul, just start talking about your photography differently or infusing some of those messages.
Yeah, it could be even linking an area of interest to a conservation purpose, like you are with Death Valley, and talking about the Mojave and the challenges there, or even you've tracked down some very rare plants, and maybe doing I'm even considering a project on that kind of aspect where you're sort of talking about these rare and endangered species and what they're, the importance of that, and doing that in a really tasteful way, and a way that brings about awareness and that kind of aspect. So I think having your own passion project in that area might be a really good step, and that's something that just even from this conversation's really got me thinking about as well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, culture has its benefits, and it has its it has the opposite as well. So it takes a lot of power and autonomy, I think, to operate independently of that, because we're human beings and we're social creatures, and we are influenced by all aspects of society. But I think, yeah, being true to yourself and being authentic to your own independent relationship with the natural world and what it means to you, I think people can't fault that. I think when people sort of sense that the heartfulness or the authenticity of your relationship with the natural world, that's what touches people, I think, more than the technical aspects sometimes. And if you walk with that, in the way you carry yourself and the way you speak and the way you shoot, then I think you're in a good position. And it claims back that power that you might have given away by the judgment of others as well. There's a lot of power in collaborative projects, and Luke and I have done a lot, and I will do for the rest of my life, because there's greater resources and energy and momentum and skill sets that are beyond yours as an individual, that means you can accomplish maybe greater things you can do on your own by contributing. But yeah, at the same time, you sort of got to pull it back. And I probably speaking a bit philosophically, but I think it's a powerful way to be in the world. Whether you're talking about global warming or the kind of overwhelming aspects that just seem too much to handle as an individual, you can just pull it back to, well, what am I doing today that's going to make a difference? So it's going to make me feel like I'm walking in the world in a positive way in this realm. And you can simplify it and just make it small steps, and it keeps that sort of the positive flame alive, that doesn't get snuffed out by some other views that aren't necessarily coming from a very proactive place anyway. So Sarah, I'm wondering if we haven't shown a lot of images on the show, and to be honest, it's one of the few shows where I feel like it hasn't actually been necessary, because the conversation's been so rich.
It's been magnificent, yeah.
It really has been. I don't know if you want to take the opportunity to show any more, or you're happy not to. I just, was going to give you that last opportunity if you wanted to. And also I wanted to give you the time before the end of the show to speak to a lot of what you have created and you offer as an educator and a writer. Sarah's work is very accessible on Instagram in terms of Sarah Marino photo for her color work, and sarahmarino.bw for her black and white work. You've seen the website. I'm not actually sure what the title of your YouTube channel is. Sarah, maybe you want to talk about that, and maybe the accessibility of your ebooks and anything else
Newsletter.
You want to sort of allude to.
Yeah. Do you want me to show a few more photos, or
Why
what
not?
do you
Oh,
think?
I'd love to.
Yeah. I feel we haven't quite done that justice. I think we've done you justice, but maybe not your images.
Okay. Well, I can talk and talk and talk, and I'm always the last to leave things. So
Yeah, sounds like
I'm good
me.
at that. So I can go through a few more photos. I'll actually really quickly. So on my website, which is smallscenes.com, we have a bunch of free portfolio ebooks. So the first one is one of Ron's of Zion National Park. And then I have 3 from Death Valley from our trip last year. So color, black and white, desert plants. And then these 2 are a little bit older. But if you want to see my work, these are some good places to see a collection of curated photos. And then also Ron's collection from Zion last year is fantastic too. So those are all easily accessible, just smallscenes.com, and then under photos, the free portfolio ebooks. And I'm almost ready to release one on Acadia National Park, and then I'm going to start working on fall colors in Mount Rainier National Park. So those are coming soon. We didn't really talk about black and white, so I could jump into.
I would love to go there if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, that sounds good. So one of the things that I love about black and white photography, I'll zoom in just a little so these fill up a little bit more of the screen. One of the things that I absolutely love about black and white photography is that it allows me to do a totally different type of work compared to my color work. So with that, as I was talking about my curated galleries, one of the examples was working with the softest light, and another example was very dreamy plants. And those are all pastel colors, very bright, low contrast processing, and just a soft overall feel. And then you look at my black and white work, and like this photo is pretty much the opposite of my color photography, where it's a very aggressive composition with very strong lines, very dramatic clouds, heavy contrast, and I've really amped up that contrast in the processing. And then you look at the rest of my work, like this is obviously very high contrast too, where it's just about the little bits of light on the edges. And then you can see just a tiny bit of texture in the sand dunes. So if you compare the photos here to those other photos that I showed earlier, it's two completely different representations of nature. And I love that black and white photography allows me to do something completely different. So my color work is grounded more in reality, where the colors are more true to life. I think the contrast is more true to life. So more the eyewitness approach to photography. Whereas black and white, I'm definitely taking the raw materials and creating something new. Like this example from Iceland, where the waves created the patterns, but then I can come in and emphasize them with dodging and burning so that those lines become even more dramatic. I can add texture to the clouds, and I can essentially shape the light a little bit more than I would ever be willing to do in color. This is one of my most popular photos that I don't quite understand why, but it's still on my website. I licensed this for more than I've licensed anything else for. Wow. So it deserves to maintain its place. If I had my Lightroom catalog open, doing the before and after on this one, the before, you can barely see those textures. It's just I took this at twilight, almost no detail and all those little swirling patterns. But then with black and white, it can totally amp up the contrast, make those cracks deep and dark, and then have the patterns, the light grays and the mid-tone grays really stand out on the tiles. So that's another example of a photo that was a real transformation.
Do you use anything like silver effects in your processing, or it's all like just curves and things in Photoshop?
I start in Lightroom, and I generally get to a black and white version in Lightroom. I know best practice is that you're supposed to preserve the colors as you go into Photoshop, but I generally get to a good solid draft in black and white, and then I open the file in Photoshop, and then I use a pretty simple set of tools. Levels adjustment is probably my favorite tool, curves. And then sometimes the black and white panel, if I've retained the colors, but I usually don't. And then luminosity masks. So I use the TK panel to do luminosity masks, because like this is a great example of where a luminosity mask would be really helpful in pulling out just these bright edges. Mm-hmm. So if I wanted to brighten just the edges of this cactus, I could do a lights luminosity mask, put it on a curve, bring up that curve, and then have everything else stay the same. Like this photo of sand dunes, a luminosity mask would be really helpful for picking up just this bright area, brightening it, or darkening just the darks so that I'm expanding that contrast. So as you can see,
I sometimes wonder what I'd do without the TK panel.
Oh yeah, I just wish that he would make a really simple one. I don't need all the other stuff.
I've had it for 8 years, and I don't think I've ever used it because I haven't really figured out how to use it yet, because it's actually not that simple.
I think what Sarah's referring to is you probably only ever use like 10% of actually what's there, and so it'd be nice to be able to have a version where it's just the percentage that you actually use sometimes. But no, it is fantastic.
It's really, really fascinating to see just how incredibly opposite the characteristics and qualities of the style of work is to It speaks a lot to your sort of adaptability and versatility of the way you see and the way you're willing to express yourself, Sarah.
Yeah, like this first photo in the recent editions here is like about as low contrast as a grand landscape can be.
Mm.
And then you head down and it's like, whoa, totally different. And like the plants compared to what I showed you earlier, like this, like incredibly dark, where the edges are almost entirely black, and just that little bit of contrast in the middle. So you can see with these plant photos, a lot of these are the same subjects that I was showing you earlier, but they're just completely different renditions. And I love the fact that I can really play with the contrast and in some ways make it more my own. Like that
Sarah, would you be able to create these similar sort of images from the same photo shoot, or would you go out with a different intentionality to be moving into more high contrast black and white? Or is it purely just you work the file from whichever shoot in that direction?
It totally depends. I generally like I can see black and white opportunities in the field, absolutely, but I don't go out with the intention of like I'm just going to photograph in black and white. Like I could look at some of these examples of like this the first, actually all three of or all four of these on the first row were photographed in the middle of the day. So in this example, I knew going out that this is the light was not conducive necessarily to my style of color photography. The sand dunes, it was probably 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So the sand dunes were very brown, very golden. And then the sky was kind of washed out. But I knew just looking at the conditions from the side of the road, I knew that going out, like this is the opportunity for black and white photography, that the swirling sand around the mountains creates that natural contrast with the mountains being dark, the sand being light. Like that's a contrast that I can emphasize. There's enough texture that I can emphasize later too, that will add a little bit of detail. So even though the colors weren't appealing, I knew that there were like I went out intentionally to photograph, to create a black and white photo on this particular day. This scene though, by contrast, like this was sunrise on a cloudy day. So on this day, I was probably hoping for color in the sky, but it never came. So I was going to work with the contrast. I'm still going to photograph because I see that this has the things that I need for black and white photography. It has the white salt circles, the dark mud, and then texture in the clouds. So those are all things that I can play up later. And that one I might have made the choice to go more to a twilight rendition, or I could make the choice to go to black and white, and they would look completely different, but that photo could go either way. So I do both.
Well, I think that really overlays to I feel like is one of the key aspects of your approach to photography is adaptability, Sarah. Like to not forego a scene, for color and just shift your mindset into where else it could go. And the very, very same scene is not something that everybody thinks about. And I think personally that's a really good reminder for me too, that I feel like we need another whole show for your black and white sick to do it any justice. But we're sort of moving to the back end of our traditional sort of length of time for the show. But it actually felt really nice to just give that little bit of breathing room, or at least the curiosity for people to explore further. Because I've definitely been quite influenced by Sarah's black and white work, and it's really been a beautiful thing for me to bounce off. And I came across that quite a long time ago, Sarah. So it was one of the first ways I engaged with your work. And yeah, I feel like I've got to know you a lot better from this conversation, and it's been a bit of a privilege to get that level of insight into the way you think and the way you operate in the world, and the journey you've taken to and where you're heading to, and the excitement and the focus and the growing discipline of how to narrow down those so they actually get done. I think me personally, and I can't speak for Luke, but I can certainly know it's a great challenge to take that tool of you're 25 down to 3 and don't do the others until that's something I'm going to take away from this one. I haven't even tried the focus bracketing feature or on my camera to even look at focus stacking. I'm going to be taking that one away. And there's a bunch of ebooks that I haven't downloaded. I have downloaded several and been through them, but there's more to come. And it's very clear to me that as an educator and a writer, like you have a fantastic way of communicating and a very holistic and very accessible way to explain things. And I think if people are looking for someone to bounce off or learn from, you're easily one of the best people that I've ever come across. So I encourage people to lean into that potential with Sarah in whatever way, whether it's physically or online or otherwise. And she has worked very, very hard to gain the position, the reputation that she has. And I think the show today is just, it's very, very clear that there doesn't need any explanation at all. Her ability and skills are all just right there.
Well, it was so great talking with the two of you and just getting to know both of you a little bit better, and sitting around talking about photography for a couple of hours is one of my favorite things. So it was great to make the connection.
I think it's an unusual position to reach across the world and build, like we're particularly interested, which is partly why we just had Alex on, to build a rapport and a relationship with the community in America, and being really open and honest and authentic about how we are in our different styles and culture, and how we can support each other in different ways to be more rounded or have a more balanced perspective on how we approach things. It's been really interesting, and I think it's something I personally would love to build that bridge a little bit more, because I think we've got a lot to learn from each other. And that sort of clarified to me, the challenges you've got and your that you see in some of the narrowness of how people isolate themselves in terms of the way they approach things. And I found that when I lived in America, and I worked there because actually my mother's American, Sarah. I've got an American passport, and I've lived in America for quite a few times. And I found that there was a culture of, if you weren't the best at one thing, talk to the hand. It's, what do you mean you did 10 different things? Oh, I don't know about that. I'll go with the one guy who just does the one thing. And in a place that's a lot smaller, like over here, we always keep very open. And I'd like to acknowledge the fact that you tend to have a mindset that is very open to the way you approach your subject matter and everything as well. And I think, to be fair, like our conversation about the conservation aspect is very, very Tasmanian as opposed to the entire of Australia. But at the same time, Tasmania has a very big influence on the wider Australian approach to landscape photography anyway. But so anyway, we can keep those bridges growing between across the world. I'm really open, Sarah, and I'm certainly, next time I'm coming over, I'm going to be trying to touch base with a lot of your colleagues and maybe yourself, especially now Alex has settled down and David's not too far away down the road and Eric's up the road again. They're three people I'd love to spend time with myself.
Yeah, well, we're all friends, so.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we do the show. We do it off our own bat. There's no commercial aspect to it at all, and it's been amazing to start building relationships with people all around the globe and sharing the different ways we see. Anything else, Sarah, that you want to make sure people are aware of or have access to before we wrap up the show?
I have some ebooks and video tutorials available in our store, and then I'm just trying to slowly build a YouTube channel. So Sarah Marino Photo.
Sarah Marino Photo, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll put that.
And otherwise, I think
you just released one on was it spring trees?
Yes. So I know that's not relevant necessarily to your audience right now, but just seeing spring trees a little bit differently. So thinking about spring as a second fall, that trees in the spring can be equally colorful as they're budding and flowering and other things, photographing them early. So not waiting until they're fully leafed out, because if you photograph trees or like early spring or late fall, you can see a lot more of their structure, which really benefits composition. Talking about being open-minded about light and how sometimes bad light can be great, like backlight with spring leaves, because they're translucent, that can actually be a really beautiful opportunity. So trying to be a little bit more open-minded about light. So I covered all of those things in that video.
I'd also like to acknowledge the person that's not in the room, which is Ron, and we haven't really had a chance to even talk about him and your relationship with him and that partnership. That might be another time. But I'll just give him a wave and say I love his work as well, and it's quite inspiring to see the two of you working together and creating something potentially that's bigger than the parts.
Yeah. Well, it feels like I have to come over and visit your landscapes, because it sure looks like there are some incredibly fascinating plants. And looking through both of your portfolios to be prepared for our conversation today, it's just like a very different scenery. Some obviously some similarities, but seems like it would be, we could find all sorts of inspiration. So it's the fact that you live in such a diverse area, it definitely shows in both of your portfolios. And I really enjoyed this conversation, and feel like it was super fun to talk about nature photography and see some of the similarities and differences between our approaches and our cultures. And it was great fun. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for making it so easy. It's sort of like, it's been one of the dreamiest shows I've ever run. It was like, you're just such a great speaker and communicator, Sarah. It's been an absolute joy.
Thank you. It was for me
Certainly
too.
has. Yeah, and yeah, obviously welcome anytime, and there's plenty of great hiking down here, so I'm sure you'll find plenty of pretty amazing things to photograph if you make it down. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll leave it there. And yeah, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for joining us, and good evening.
Thanks again, Sarah. See you, everyone.
See you, Sarah.
Bye, everyone.